So, have you got your Christmas shopping done? No, I'm hearing a lot of no's here this morning. Me neither. I haven't got mine done either, so pray for my wife and my children, because it gets busier from here on out, doesn't it? Anyway, I was thinking about Christmas shopping, and when you're Christmas shopping, and we're that season where we're trying to find gifts for people, and we got people in our lives where we're trying to figure out what to give them, and I find that there's two ways I approach gift giving, or actually buying to give. And I don't know if this is how it works for you, but one is I can really think through and think about the person and try and give that gift that I think will bring meaning to that relationship or my appreciation for them, which is the place I usually like to function out of. You know, that's the place I like to be when I purchase a gift. But to be honest with you, sometimes I'm going out and I'm going, okay, what should I buy them that they won't return? You know, what can I buy them that they'll like? What will help them to accept the gift that I am giving them rather than rejecting it? Has anybody ever had a gift get rejected? You've given somebody a gift and they kind of look at it, they open it up and they go, not exactly what I expected, you know. You know, that's what it's a fear, it's that fear that's driving some of our gift buying, you know. We're like, what do I get this person so that I don't see that frown on their face? I thought about some things that I would advise people not to give, and that would be things like fruitcakes. No, can I get a witness over here? Yes, no fruitcakes. How about no Chia Pets? I'm going to think, you know, I looked on, and they've got now out an Obama Chia Pet. And I thought, this is just not right. That is not right. Another thing that it would be, you know, the Snuggie. I've seen a lot of commercials for, you know, the Snuggie. And that's one of the pretty bad commercials. Also, if you're married, I wouldn't advise getting any type of exercise equipment for Christmas, or any dieting books, or anything like that for that significant other in your life. And so those are some of the things, just a few tips this morning as you venture out into the world later this week to buy gifts. But a part of it is that fear of the gift being rejected. And sometimes we even take that personally, don't we? Because sometimes we can interpret the rejection of the gift as the rejection of us. I think about God sending God's Son into the world fully knowing that some would reject that gift. And yet, God came anyway. And God came to this young teenager named Mary in a Galilean village called Nazareth, and called her the favored one, which would be perplexing words, I think, if you were a teenage girl and an angel came to you and said, you're favored because you're about to give birth, quote, in the society's eyes, illegitimately, that this is not going to be something that's going to raise your reputation in the eyes of your village, in the eyes of your community, that you will face potential rejection based on what you accept from this message. I think about that, how Mary had to, at some level, think about that. Think about, what will Joseph think? What will my family think? That fear of being rejected or being dismissed would have been on her mind, I would think, when this message came, or maybe after she had heard it. And how do you wrestle with that? How does she go from fearing that message, that favored one message, that she would be the one to carry the Son of God, to accepting that plan? How do you wrestle with that? There's a tension there, I think. This fear that sometimes, the fear of what others will think of us versus what God is asking us to do. I was pastoring one particular church, and one Sunday morning I drove up to the church, and there was a long driveway leading up to the building, up this road. It was a long road, and the church sat right on the hill on the side of the road. And as I was driving up that road, I noticed that someone the night before had evidently rolled down the window and started throwing out empty beer cans out onto the lawn, you know, all down the road. You just see them littered down the road, and a Miller Lite box at the end, you know, was down there. So I went to the church and I parked the car, and I thought, you know, I should go clean that up. So I walked down to the end of the street and pick up the first empty and grab the Miller Lite box, and I throw the first empty in the box, and I go get the next empty, and I throw it in the box, and all the way back up to the church, I'm throwing all these empty beer cans into this 12-pack box. And as I get up and I'm done and I'm approaching the church, I'm walking up to the church with the 12-pack in my hand, and sure enough, church member drives by at just the right time and looks over at the pastor carrying a 12-pack into the church. And I thought, oh, this doesn't look good. That was my initial thought, was, oh, this isn't going to be good, you know. I got to go do damage control here. What's going to happen, to the pastor's reputation. But then there's that concern that should I not do the right thing because somebody might look wrong on it. Somebody might not see it the right way. And I think I did the right thing, even though my reputation was at stake. And I've certainly cleared it up. But you think about that, how much do we do to try and manage our perception to the world and the others around us, that we engage in this management, that we want others to see us a certain way. Mary didn't seem to be hung up with that. Mary seemed to be willing to accept what God was asking her to do, to get in and to be accepting of God's plan. That's the question. Are we going to give in to our fear? Or are we going to accept God's plan, even if it means that it might cause us some grief? Are we willing to accept God's plan? That's the one thing I love about Mary, is that Mary's just plain willing. She's just willing. She's not ready, but she's willing. She'd never been a mom before. She wasn't equipped to handle the pressures of not only being a mom, but also to potentially end up as a single mom in a patriarchal society. If she were to lose Joseph, if she were to enter into this child, she would have been a single mom in a world that would have rejected her and would have put her out on the streets. She and the child would have been destitute. But she trusted in God's plan. She trusted God to work those things out and to not give into those fears. And so she was willing and available to God's plan. I'm amazed at, when I read the Bible, all the ways that God uses people who are just simply willing. Moses took a little convincing, but eventually he just made himself available to God. And God used this shepherd and fugitive to bring about the release of God's people. I think about Deborah, who stepped up as a judge and leader in the nation of Israel at a time when nobody else would step up and take leadership. She was willing to make herself available. I think of all the disciples. None of them had credentials as religious leaders, and yet they made themselves available to follow Christ and to do what God was asking them to do. God works with willingness and availability. The question of call in our lives, the question of purpose in our lives, God comes to us with the question, not are we ready, but are we willing? Are we willing to follow God's plan? There's an old saying in the church, and you may have heard it, that God equips the called, God doesn't call the equipped. That our job is just to respond, and God will take care of the rest. God will take care of the equipping. God will take care of the circumstances. God will take care of us as we follow and make ourselves available to God's plan. The other thing that amazes me about what happened with Mary was that it seems to me that God is willing, when we're willing, to use anyone for His purposes, for God's purposes. That God will take a teenager in an obscure village in Galilee and use her life for something significant, of great significance. That God will work with anyone who will put themselves out there for God. At that same church I told you about where I got accused of being an alcoholic, I'm just kidding, I wasn't accused of being an alcoholic, but same church, every morning I'd come in Sunday morning and I'd get ready for the 8 o'clock service, much like I came in this morning. And every Sunday morning at 7:30, our head usher for the 8 o'clock service came in to serve as the head usher. His name was Charlie, and he was in his 40s. And Charlie was born with Down syndrome. And Charlie came in every Sunday morning at 7:30, and his first stop was my office. And so Charlie would come in and he'd sit down as I was preparing for the last minute notes, reviewing my notes for the sermon. He'd come in and sit down, and he'd come in, say hi, and he'd begin to tell me everything that happened that week in his life and in his home. And if his mom knew some of the stuff that he told me, I never told her. But I know she would have been embarrassed. But that Charlie was just so honest about what was going on in his life. And then I began to learn that 52 weeks out of the year, Charlie was going to come and sit in my office every Sunday morning. And then after he'd leave my office, he'd go and he'd grab the church bulletins, and he'd open up the doors, and he'd stand there, and he'd wait for people to come. And when he would see people come in the door, his face would light up, and he'd smile. And the people he knew well, he would hug or put his arm around. He would welcome them, and he would just love them because he loved everybody. It didn't matter who you were, Charlie was going to love you when you came in that door. And I think about that, and I think about how people were coming to worship, but some Sundays I think people just came to get a hug from Charlie. Because, see what I'm saying is that God was using Charlie to minister to people. Someone who maybe the world would say God couldn't use, but that's not the way God works. God can use anyone. God can work through anybody's life. Charlie was just simply willing to make himself available to serve God. And he did it faithfully. And he's still doing it today. And if you were to go into that church today, you would find Charlie handing out bulletins, and you'd find a smile. And if he got to know you, he'd even give you a hug. So if you need a hug, I'll give you the address of the church. God can work with anyone who is available. And the other thing that I love about this story with Mary, with this event with Mary, is that when we're willing, we're available, we're willing to accept God's plan in our lives, that God gives us the strength to accomplish it. God works out the circumstances to accomplish it. I remember a great story from a grandfather who said one time he was in the breakfast table one morning, drinking his cup of coffee, and the window was open. It was summertime, and his granddaughter was in the backyard in the sandbox with a friend. And the two girls were making sandcastles, and the one girl said to his granddaughter, "My sandcastle is better than yours." She said, "It is not. Mine's better than yours. It's got a moat." She said, "Well, mine has this." And then, so this went back and forth. Mine's better than yours. This is better than mine. And then they finally went on to dads. The next level is, well, my dad's bigger than your dad. And then the granddaughter said to her friend, "Well, I can walk a whole 3 miles. And the other little girl said, "You cannot walk 3 miles. That's a long way to walk." And the granddaughter says proudly, "When I hold my grandfather's hand and walk with him, I can walk 3 miles." And at that, grandfather smiled in the kitchen, because he knew that it's true. She on her own could not walk the 3 miles, but with him holding her hand, she could accomplish things she never could have without him. I think about that, how often we sometimes forget to invite God into the plan, our plans, and invite God to take God's hand and allow God to lead us and strengthen us for the journey ahead, for what God is asking us to do. And that's what Mary did. Mary took God's hand, accepted God's plan, and said, "I trust you, God. I know you can work this out." And so it's my hope for you that in whatever way God may be calling you or asking you to get more in on God's plan for your life or for what God may want to do through you, that you'll simply be willing to take God's hand. just make yourself available to what God may be doing. Amen?